Just want me to fill in my signature. Okay.
No, you have a good day, please. Good.
Well, we'll see with regard to the pandemic, because although in some sense it is in some ways over, our reaction to it is by no means over. And part of the reason that we overreacted, I would say, so precipitously to it is that we were unprepared for such things in our naivety. And then we rushed to imitate a totalitarian society in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic emergence. And that's something that everybody should think about a lot. And we're not done with all that totalitarian nonsense yet. A lot of that's driven by, well, fear and naivety. I mean, 50% of Democrats in the United States believe you have a 50% chance of being hospitalized with COVID, and 25% of Republicans believe the same thing. And you can point a finger at people and laugh at their ignorance, but you should really ask, well, why is this overestimate of that magnitude, and what does that mean in relationship to policy? And I've had conversations with people advising at the highest level of government, particularly in Canada, who've told me flat out, and they're very reliable sources, that none of the COVID policy for the last year was driven by reliance on science. It's all opinion poll. And that's really pernicious because, well, who's asking the questions, and how did they set up the answer, and who's answering, and in what emotional state? And so to what degree are we led by considerations of short-term propitiation of unwarranted fear? Well, that's no way for free people to live. It certainly won't work in the long run. We're already seeing tremendous supply chain disruptions and likely the emergence of an inflationary pressure that we haven't experienced since the 1970s in the aftermath of the oil shocks. And none of that has sorted itself out yet. I believe that we will conclude that our response to the pandemic caused more death and misery than the pandemic itself. And we have no end game in sight. Another thing I asked the people that I was speaking with is like, well, when is this over? Well, we don't know. Well, what would over look like? Well, we don't really know. And now what you see is this insistence on about a monthly basis that a new and radically different variant has emerged. And this viruses mutate all the time, but this virus particularly mutates, and there are small mutations and medium-sized mutations, numbers, let's say, and also effect, and larger scale mutations. When is that a variant? Well, how about whenever it's convenient for the pharmaceutical companies? You think, well, that's cynical. Is it now? The biggest lawsuits in the history of the American judicial system have been levied against the largest pharmaceutical companies on a regular basis for the last 20 years. And since when has it been a proposition of the political left that pharmaceutical companies necessarily have our best interests in mind? Now, I'm not particularly cynical about pharmaceutical companies. I think they have a hard job, both in terms of research and development and marketing and sales. And they're going to do what they can to market and sell. But that doesn't mean that they are now to be the arbiters of all public policy, because our politicians are too cowardly and incompetent to do anything but devolve their responsibilities to so-called experts, domain experts. Politics is not public health. That's medicine. Politics is the art of analyzing the entire situation and charting a course forward, all things considered. And for politicians to trot out the experts and say, follow the science, just means that they've abdicated their own responsibilities. And I think it's appalling. I mean, I'm not convinced that the evidence that masks work is scientifically credible. It's certainly at least doubtful. And that's just masks. I read a paper the other day suggesting that to prevent the transmission of one case of COVID, you have to lock down 1,000 people. Like, how is that justifiable? Especially given that the mortality rate of COVID is actually quite low, unless you have a pre-existent health problem, particularly obesity, and although old age also qualifies, as it does for most diseases, but not all. and with regards to, let's say, the issue of child vaccination, is like children have an unbelievably tiny chance of dying from COVID. I don't think there's any scientific justification for immunizing children under 12. Now, at least it's debatable, and I'm not a domain expert, although I'm a decent scientist and I know how to read the research material. And so, well, we'll see what we have to learn from these tectonic shifts underneath. And, you know, you might ask yourself, well, was that a tectonic shift in dire physical necessity because the COVID virus was genuinely so dangerous? Or was it an indication tectonically of our absolute inadequacy in the face of even a moderate existential challenge? And maybe it's a little column A and a little column B, you know? So
I have to ask the question, if we were to make your Jordan Peterson the president of the world, and these were your decisions to make, do you know what you would have done differently or in response to this virus emerging in Wuhan?
I would say, well, thank you for the offer, but I declined the position. And the reason I would say that is because I think the right solution to the most serious problems is to be found at the level of the individual. So I don't think, if I wanted to pursue what I regarded as the ultimate goal, the ultimate goal for me is the encouragement of the individual. And that's not essentially a political enterprise. It's essentially a theological enterprise. And politics has to be subordinate to that. And so I've debated throughout the entire course of my life whether I would adopt a political career. It was my initial ambition when I was very young, 14, I would say. But when push came to shove at every decision point in my life, if I had to choose between working on the encouragement of the individual and pursuing a political career, I always chose the former. And that's happened every time the decision has come up. I've been approached by people in Canada to involve myself more deeply in a practical role, and also publicly as a political figure, but I'd rather do what I'm doing. I'm in contact with people working politically all the time, both on the people in the middle, people on the right, people on the left. I'm agnostic about that because I know full well that conservatives have something to say and left-leaning liberals have something to say. That's basically predicated to some degree on their temperament. So conservatives tend to be more conscientious, so that's orderly and industrious, dutiful, patriotic, willing to make and keep verbal contracts, reliable, capable of implementation at the level of detail. That's kind of conservative virtues there, but they tend to be lower in creativity, openness to experience. They don't think as divergently, and their conscientiousness tends to constrain their creativity. Whereas the liberal types, they're high in openness to experience. That's the creativity dimension, but they tend to be lower in conscientiousness, particularly orderliness. And so what that means is those with a liberal temperament tend to be creative / entrepreneurs, and those with a conservative temperament tend to be managerial and administrative. That doesn't mean they can't run businesses. Well, you want a conservative person to run your business. You might want a more liberal person to pepper you with off-the-wall ideas, and then if you're going to run an enterprise, business, or a society, there has to be a continual dialogue between people of different temperaments so that we can keep the ship of state, let's say, tracking to an ever-moving destination. That's why free speech is so necessary. It's not another right. It's the right. So because none of us know what's going on in the final analysis, because the future is different than the past, really, we have to talk about what to do all the time. Because even if we made wise decisions in the past, that doesn't mean that we can mindlessly replicate those decisions right now in the present to deal with a changing future. So I want to help encourage people to become the sort of people who can engage in that free dialogue. And I think that's the best way forward, especially as we all become more technologically powerful. It's like, you better be smart enough to use your iPhone. And that's pretty damn smart, let's say wise, because that's no trivial gadget. And if you're not careful with it, it will turn on you. It will build authoritarian presumptions into our artificial intelligence systems, for example, and then look the hell out. So if you're going to have a hydrogen bomb, you better be wise enough to wield it.